What I really like about this program is that it's not an academic program, that it's really practitioners, that it's people working in education, in strengthening the capacity, the finance of entrepreneurs. And as such, I feel a little bit that I'm an outsider because I'm going to give a little bit of an academic talk. But I try not to make it too academic as well. Of course, it's important to understand, really, to get a good research base on what is going on in conflict countries, as well as how it affects labor markets and the occupational choice of people. So it's very important to get the science right, and for a long time the science has been neglected just because it's so difficult to research entrepreneurship in conflict countries. But I think we get a better understanding now, and I want to share that with you today. I also want to take the challenge to try and translate as much as possible the research into practical policy advice, also for the specific entrepreneurs, but also for the governments, the development corporations, and the NGOs that are helping entrepreneurs in this important task. So I'm talking about the results from a research project that was supported by the Finnish government, the Swedish Development Agency, and led by the United Nations. And I'm also drawing in on a recent research project that I've worked with the World Bank. What these projects have in common is that they have, for the first time, gone into conflict countries to micro-level data. So they've surveyed entrepreneurs and tried to do this as representative and as randomly as possible. And for the first time taken this data, in some cases like in Sierra Leone, is actually a panel data, and try to see to what extent we can paint a picture of how entrepreneurs are affected by conflict, and perhaps even how they in a way can contribute to peace after conflict. And the most important thing, of course, is that we know from the conflict literature, and we know from the experience, that conflict destroys lives, it destroys infrastructure, it creates huge risk and uncertainty. And so the first thing that you face in a conflict country, and even in a post-conflict situation, is huge risks. And entrepreneurs need to deal with the risk. And we are not, I think, you know, as talking also as somebody at the university who tries to teach entrepreneurship to students, I think we are still not very good at teaching people how to manage risk, how to deal with risk. We very often want to take away the risk. We think that if there is a risk-free environment, that would be better. But we also realize that there is an inverse relationship between risk and return. There is very often the most risky activities that have the best return rates, and that generates the best productivity growth. And so very often the problem in post-conflict situations, I'll elaborate a little bit further, is that we try to get as much people into kind of like risk-free or riskless type of activities, and many times the people choose that themselves because they don't have insurance. Insurance markets are failing. They don't have any social protection. And of course, these low-risk activities don't have high rates of return. They don't grow. They don't create jobs. They're not really, the type of entrepreneurship, I think, that will contribute to economic growth and structural change that we want to sustain post-conflict peace. So I'm going to present a little bit about the project and about the database. I've tried to draw 8 lessons from this quantitative work, and I'll give you the references where you can read in much greater detail what has been done. But there's basically 8 lessons that I try to simplify, from the importance to understand exactly what are the linkages between conflict and entrepreneurship, the importance of simplifying supply chains, of investing in human capital after the conflict, the importance of looking at the family unit and the role of women, the importance of prioritizing business survival. Often there is a trade-off between efficiency and survival, and I think survival in this case trumps the other considerations. I'm going to talk about the impact of geographical differentiation. We often talk about a country being in conflict, but we know that conflict affects the space of the economy much different. There are regions that are actually prospering in a country when some regions are in conflict. I'll tell some stories, for instance, from Colombia, and invested interest barriers to entry and the potential of destructive entrepreneurship is something that I think we should also keep in mind. So, without further ado, let me go through the 8 lessons. The first lesson is, I think, the broader rationale for the project that we started on, and the idea was to understand a little bit more what is the impact of conflict on entrepreneurship. And the immediate thing to realize at the beginning is that entrepreneurs are are in business for themselves. They want to create wealth for themselves. They want to earn an income for themselves. If they can do that by being engaged in lobbying, in unproductive activities, in illegal activities, without being punished or having incur a cost, then they would probably choose that route. They don't necessarily do that because they want to generate economic growth or welfare for a country. If that happens, that's fine, and that's what we'd like to see. But essentially, they are driven by their own objectives. And this means that when there is conflict, you can have both a positive and a negative impact on entrepreneurship. So in this framework, we looked at the different phases of entrepreneurship, from the startup phase on the top row, down to the fact that some firms are exiting or they are passing on the firm to a next generation. So firms are started up, they grow, perhaps they start exporting and moving to other countries. Maybe they at some stage are broken up, they are sold, or maybe they are passed down to the next generation, or the firm is stopped. We find that there is a huge number of firms that actually stop operating after a particular period of time. And on each of these phases of the firm's life cycle, if you want to call it that, the conflict in a country has a positive and a negative impact. So we find, for instance, that you can have, for instance, a lot of positive opportunities relating to security businesses, to construction, to alternative supply chains, to the movement of goods and services, to smuggling, etc. So there's a lot of people that benefit from conflict. There is also diaspora networks that are benefiting from having lots of people from a country in a particular region. But there are also negative impacts, which I think we most often focus on. And I think the point that I want to make from this first line is that don't forget the positive impact, because very often after the conflict has ended, it's the people that have benefited from the conflict that may be very reluctant to give up their income streams and their livelihoods that are to an extent linked to the conflict. The second point is if you're in conflict and you run an enterprise and you want to continue working in an enterprise or even create a new enterprise, then you need to simplify your business processes, because the more complex your business chain is, the more complex what you are offering, the more subject that is to high transaction cost and uncertainty and being disrupted. And so we see, for instance, that the clever entrepreneurs know how to maintain their supply chain of what they need. And they simplify and diversify their supply chains more efficiently. There's a very good case study in the Journal of Conflict Resolution that I will give you the reference that came out of this project, that describes in Liberia how the front of conflict is always shifting, but the good entrepreneurs find ways of maintaining their supply chains around these conflict areas. The third important lesson that we show here is that, and this relates to the first slide's point of simplifying processes, we often find that entrepreneurs are regressing in terms of the technological sophistication of their production technologies or their business technologies. In other words, they become simpler because it's more durable. In a way, their innovation is what we would call a regressive innovation. So we still classify it as being innovative, but it's actually doing the opposite than what we would understand in other countries as being innovative. So these innovative entrepreneurs, they survive the war. This is what's important. But in post-conflict reconstruction, it's very important for them to rebound, to continue and adjust again to best practice. There's a paper in our issue by Paul Collier and Marguerite Duponchel where they talk about forgetting by not doing. So what they say is that if after a while a firm is operating really very simplistic processes and services than before the war, then they actually forget by not doing it for some period of time. And that after the conflict you have depressed productivity of firms. They really have difficulty growing because they cannot improve their productivity and also pay better wages. The graph that I there have, it's the kernel density estimates of firm level productivity, especially informal non-farm enterprises. This is the first time that this graph has been, a graph like this has been drawn. It's based on recent data from the World Bank, Living Standard Measurement Surveys, and it's in a paper that we just published on the World Bank cycle. This shows you the enterprise productivity in the different regions of Uganda. And if you know Uganda, you'll know that the northern area has for a long time been subject to an insurgency. And you can see that still today, even though the position has relatively been resolved, you can still see that the productivity is to the far left of the curve. In other words, it's much lower, the average productivity of non-farm informal enterprises than, for instance, in the Kampala region or other regions that have not been affected by conflict. So what this means is that even long time after the conflict, you find that the productivity in areas that were affected by conflict are still much lower than productivity levels elsewhere. Now, why does productivity levels matter? Well, we know that firms that are more productive tend to survive longer than firms that are not productive. They tend to grow, they tend to create more jobs. So we do find that there is some form of hysteresis, some form of path dependency, that once you had the conflict, that you are kind of like, you may be locked in for a long time into a low productivity situation. And so very important to develop management skills, investment in human capital, improvements in technology to raise productivity levels of firms. We also were very much under the awareness that keeping firms in the family becomes very important. It's very important in developing countries in any case, as it is, for instance, in the Netherlands or other developing countries, but it becomes particularly important during conflict times because you need trust, you need to deal with uncertainty, you have a breakdown in contract enforcement, in property rights, and in a way keeping businesses in a family internalizes many of the risks of conflict. But again, it comes with a cost. We know that in many cases, family firms are not really striving for good efficiency, not striving for productivity growth, and also is a way of self-insuring the family against all kinds of hazards. We have also found that, for instance, in many of the fragile countries in Africa, that there is a very high probability that a household or a family will start an enterprise if they have suffered from an external shock like a drought or a flood, or even somebody in the family dying or becoming ill, is often a stimulus to start a firm because there is no insurance. Everybody focuses on microcredit but ignores microinsurance. There is not general crop insurance in agriculture, and there is very negligible social security. Africa still has the lowest portion and percentages of social security of all the regions in the world. And this is something that we need to deal with. We also have looked at the role of women. There is a very fine analysis by Tillman Brook and co-authors of the role of widows in Mozambique, where their husbands have been lost during the war and they have to shoulder a particularly important burden also for running family businesses. And then they are very much constrained. We have found that, not in the case of Mozambique, but in other cases in Africa, that women are not necessarily constrained in terms of getting finance, but they are constrained in terms of the type of businesses that they can enter. So we found, for instance, that certain enterprises, for instance in transport, restaurants and bars, are much more productive and profitable, but almost no women get access to enter these type of sectors. They are normally more easier to get access to low productivity type of sectors and easy to enter sectors where maybe capital and so on are less of a problem. I already mentioned the importance of survival. This is that almost all of the papers in our work discover some form of what we call a phoenix effect. That's to say that the firms are really heavily damaged and find it very difficult during the conflict period, but that somehow after the conflict has stopped, there is some form of rebounding effect, that they very quickly tend to bounce back to the levels that they were operating at before the conflict. The other interesting point, and this has come clearly out also in the case of Colombia. Colombia has had a conflict for many, many decades, and it affected different regions differently than other regions. And here we actually found that there is an internal spillover effect from conflict countries. When people are displaced, they move to adjacent municipalities and they boost the demand in these areas. So we found that there are areas where there's actually quite good growth of entrepreneurship and quite profitable businesses, but this is a shifting of the economic activity within the space. We found the same thing in Afghanistan, we find the same in Sierra Leone. So this is something that's very important to take into consideration. Exactly where are the conflict and where are the regions within the country that are more negatively affected. Then the final lesson has to do with disruptive entrepreneurship, non-productive entrepreneurship, and this deals with the question that there has been vested interest and that there are barriers to entry. And often businesses' interests that were built up during the war continue to dominate and crowd out competition after the war. And this means, interestingly enough, that in many countries, the cost of doing business rises after the war, not during the war. So, for instance, there you have from the World Bank's cost of doing business indicators, you have a comparison between Afghanistan and Angola, a country that's in conflict and a country that's out of conflict. And this is just for comparison's sake with an advanced country which has not had any conflicts for a very, very long period of time, just to show you as a benchmark. And you can see that in Angola, the cost of doing business and the entry barriers are much, much higher, say, than in Afghanistan. And if you go down into this is where I think the quantitative research always needs to be complemented by good qualitative studies and an understanding of the particular context in a country. The context of Angola is very much of oligopolies and vested interest in the country, also with what they call bureaucrats in business, keeping it very difficult, making it very difficult for other businesses to enter into the market. And this is also something I think that we need to take care of in post-conflict situations, that it's actually possible for new entrants to enter into the market, because very often these new businesses are undermining the rents and the bribe culture that may exist in a particular economy. So that is the short 8 lessons. Maybe I could have drawn more lessons from the work, but maybe this is also a challenge for the audience. For further reading, I would recommend there is a special issue of the Journal of Conflict Resolution that contains 8 or 9 papers that were eventually selected. And the whole issue deals with entrepreneurship and conflict. And you will find here very detailed quantitative studies, very rigorous studies, dealing with countries from like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Colombia, etc. And each discussing the impact on entrepreneurship, the considerations of entrepreneurs, their investment behavior, the supply chain behavior, etc. We also made a short summary of the special issue in a United Nations University Policy Brief. These are all available also online for downloading. I think my time is also running up. I wanted to give you a quick bird's eye view of this work. You can also read a little bit more if you have the slides. I can also point to the last paper there on non-farm enterprises in rural Africa. This is a very recent paper that we presented at the annual bank conference in Paris in June, and it's based on a very unique data set covering 6 African countries, and where you can also see, for instance, in the case of Uganda, the legacy of violent conflict. But you can also look at the impact of shocks and of the general policy environment on the situation facing entrepreneurship. I think in conclusion that everybody is really looking for a magic bullet or a magic pill that entrepreneurs can get that will make them very successful as entrepreneurs, but we know that's very difficult. Even in advanced countries, policymakers and support organizations find it very difficult to stimulate and support entrepreneurship. And the challenge is so much bigger in countries with conflict, and there are so many more pitfalls that can mean that resources can be misspent, misused, and the situation can actually be made worse by skewing prices, by interfering in the local markets, etc. So it's really a very important topic, and a topic which I think really deserves a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, and I think therefore, again, my congratulations to Spark for organizing really a brilliant event where a lot of people are here with real interest and passion for the topic, and really serious to try and find that magic bullet or magic pill that can have entrepreneurs make a real good contribution that they can make potentially to peace and stability. I thank you very much.